Hello, y'all. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon. My name is Melanie Ho. I'm an assistant professor of practice in the Seventh Studies department. And I have the distinct honor of introducing our SouthTalk speaker today. So, Dr. Benjamin Franklin Chavis is an esteemed civil rights leader, global business leader, faith leader, and public intellectual. He was born in Oxford, North Carolina. His family has been deeply rooted in Granville County, North Carolina, as landowners, farmers, educators, theologians, physicians, and activists for over 250 years. Chavis hosts the Chavis Chronicles, a weekly broadcast on PBS. Dr. Chavis will be speaking today about Southern environmental justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Chavis.
Thank you very much. Thank you. First, I'm very honored to be here on the campus of University of Mississippi here in Oxford, Mississippi. I'm from Oxford, North Carolina. There are a lot of Oxfords. Normally I tell people I'm from Oxford, they think I'm from London. But I said, no, there's a distinguished place in Mississippi called Oxford, and there's a distinguished place in North Carolina called Oxford. I'm also here this morning with another, I would say, probably one of the most distinguished persons in the environmental justice movement, who was referred to as the mother of the environmental justice movement, Dolly Burwell. Let's give her a hand. Dolly Burwell from Warren County. Another point of irony, Dolly and I are actually members of the same church in Warren County, North Carolina, Oak Level United Church of Christ. So there are many intersections, and I know I don't have a long time, but I do want to lay out a few basic points about Southern environmental justice. My background is that I was born in 1948. I grew up in the 1950s. I was one of the youngest youth coordinators for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But also I had great mentors, Dr. Charles E. Cobb, the Executive Director and CEO of the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. Both Dolly and I worked for the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. And if there was any one organization as a sole organization that contributed to the evolution of the environmental justice movement, it is the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, which was the instrumentality of the United Church of Christ. If you know, the United Church of Christ is integrated, predominantly white Protestant denomination. Grew out of the Congregational Church. These were the Pilgrims. So a lot of our churches are called Pilgrim United Church of Christ, Mayflower United Church of Christ, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, there are a few congregational churches here in Mississippi also. So the role of the church in the evolution of the Southern environmental justice movement, but I would say the role of the church in our religious bodies, because that's not the church now, it's the churches, it's synagogues, it's mosques, other temples. People see that religion has some, or should have something to say about the climate, should have something to say about the environment. Dolly's heard me say this before. My favorite scripture is from Psalm 24. In the Bible it says, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all who dwell therein." So if the earth is the Lord's, if that's what we advocate theologically, that means we have to see the earth as sacred. We have to see air that we breathe as sacred. We have to see the water that we drink is sacred. When we had the first People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. in 1991, I have to give credit to our Native American brothers and sisters to remind us of the sacredness of the earth. Some of us, I think, misread the scripture and say, well, yes, the Lord created all this, but humanity is supposed to subdue the earth, supposed to exploit the earth, supposed to extract from the earth. Well, part of my background, not only in civil rights, I was a chemist. And I didn't decide to go into the ministry until April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. I remember that day so vividly because there were two sanitation strikes going on at the same time, one in Memphis and one in Charlotte, North Carolina, both by the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, asking me, basic sanitation workers, wanted a better salary, wanted a better quality of life, and in order to make their point, both Tennessee and North Carolina, Mississippi too, were anti-union states. And it was very difficult for the organization of labor to achieve. But in Memphis, there was a serious sanitation strike that was successful. That's why Dr. King went to Memphis. And that was on April 4th, and on April 5th, he was supposed to come to Charlotte. I was making the advance plans for him to visit Charlotte after leaving Memphis, but obviously he didn't make it. Anyway, on that day, after crying profusely, I decided I was finished my chemistry degree, but I'm going back to study ministry, to study philosophy, to study religion, for one primary purpose, and that was to keep Dr. King's dream alive. We cannot afford to allow an assassin to assassinate a movement. And what we're talking about here today, when we say Southern environmental justice, I would say Southern environmental justice movement. A goal of justice, equality, of equity are goals, but you cannot attain these goals if there's not a movement of people that is organized and mobilized to attain freedom, justice, and equality and equity for all people. And I know equity is a little debated word right now. Some people think that the use of the term equity means that some people are going to get benefits that they really don't deserve, but they don't get the benefits because of their race or because of some hardship in the past. That's not my definition of equity. I get the word equity from the scripture. If the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof means distributive benefit to everybody without discrimination, without race being a factor. So I'm giving you all of these little tidbits before I get into my 3 points that I want you to remember. Dolly has to leave, so she said, man, make your major points before she leaves. She has to. So I'm going to try to keep her in demand. The reason I'm giving this background is because by 1982, actually it started in 1978, but by 1982, it was clear that the state of North Carolina, my home state, was very deliberate, intentional to target the most predominant black county in North Carolina is Warren County, W-A-R-R-E-N. And this county was targeted for a PCB, a polychlorinated biphenyl dump, a PCB dump. Polychlorinated biphenyl is a very carcinogenic, very cancer-causing. And Dolly and I lived in that county. I had moved away in the 1980s back to DC and New York because I spent most of the 1970s in prison in North Carolina as a member of the Wilmington 10. So the last thing I wanted to do is come back to North Carolina and get arrested again. In my civil rights career, I've been arrested about 67 times. And of the 67 arrests, I spent the most time in prison around the Wilmington 10 case. I had a 34-year sentence for trying to integrate the schools in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1972. So when I heard that Donald Trump was convicted of 34 felonies, I said, I wonder if there's going to be an equal application of the justice system, criminal justice system for him. But let's fast forward. I want to go back to 1982. Through the efforts of Dolly and other women and children, and some men, but the movement started with women and children who decided that they were not going to allow thousands of trucks with tons of PCB-laden soil to be dumped in that community. Even though the state had promised, look, this is a landfill, it's state of the art, we're gonna put this plastic around it, and certainly it will not leak. People have nothing to worry about. Well, that was the science back in that day. I think it was pseudoscience. I don't think they had done enough research. It was almost experimental, and they wanted to experiment on this predominant black community. So what happened was we decided to protest. Dolly and her children were arrested. I was arrested. 500 people were arrested. And because 500 people were arrested over a 6-week period, it caught the attention for the rest of the world. And so one of the points I'm trying to make about Southern environmental justice is that what happens in the South helps determine what happens to the rest of the nation. The environmental justice movement was started in the South, expanded in the South, and then grew to other parts of the United States. And quite frankly, the environmental justice movement today is international, it's global. It's not just a local movement or a regional movement or a national movement, it's an international movement. But it started in the South. You know, I'm very proud of what the sisters and brothers in Warren County were able to achieve, not only in their protests, but raising the consciousness of people that if you believe your earth is sacred, if you believe that your community is worthy of not having cancer-causing toxins to be deposited in a community that primarily got its water from well water, then not only had a right to protest, we had a responsibility to protest. We not only had a right to build a movement, we had a responsibility to build a movement. And so I was very pleased to go back to my home state and join the movement. There's a connection between the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement. The civil rights movement, what we know as the civil rights movement, was also started in the South. Why? Because movements start where the contradictions are the highest. So when we talk about the Southern environmental justice issue, or the Southern environmental justice principle of understanding the importance of environmental justice, the importance of climate justice, the importance of people being engaged not only with ecological matters, but also economic matters, but also cultural matters, but also, I would say, matters that determine the quality of life for all people. Because what we learned in the civil rights movement is the same thing we learned in the environmental justice movement. Every inch of progress that people of color have made in all these movements has inured benefit to all Americans. You know, if you see films of and there was a great film last night that was shown. Let's give our filmmaker and others a hand for having that marvelous film last night. It's winning an award. I think we need more films like what we saw last night that document not just the resilience of people when they're oppressed, but document people's consciousness leads to action that leads to reform, that leads to change. And so I do want to just annotate one point. When we talk about Southern environmental justice, we're not just talking about Southern United States. We're talking about the Southern people who live near the equator and south of the equator. Also find themselves targeted for environmental injustice. A lot of the outcries in Brazil or in Southern Africa and other places in Latin America is because these communities also have been targeted. These communities have also been triaged in terms of their interests of having clean water, clean air, and uncontaminated food to consume. The United Nations now has a program on environmental justice. The EPA today has offices on environmental justice as well as programs on environmental justice. So I applaud the progress that we've made, But I think it was instructive for this talk today is to recall that in 1980, Ronald Reagan was president. In the 1980s, the EPA was led by people who did not protect the environment, but protected the people who gave pollution into the environment. Because at that time, the thought was that in order to have a successful economy, you have to focus on the industrialization, you have to focus on those companies, those entities that provided yes jobs. And so the interest of the environment was considered important, but not as important as economic development, not important as expansion of industrialized entities. And that is why you find the highest rate of cancer connected to the environment also in the South of the United States. Cancer Alley is in Louisiana. You know, Jackson, Mississippi is in Mississippi. Can't get fresh water to drink. Even though there's government funding to straighten out all that, but the politics of the state, I'm talking about this state, leaves the residents of the capital city of Mississippi disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards. So while we focused and we celebrate what happened in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, giving birth to the movement, we also have to be cognizant that the consciousness and the outcry and the demand for environmental justice is still very prevalent today. While we made progress, no question about it, but the progress that we made still has not reached the level of involvement and engagement to end Cancer Alley. In fact, a federal judge ruled in Louisiana that the EPA's focus on Cancer Alley was a violation of the Constitution because it was focusing on giving black people relief. And of course now, even the movements for justice, we have to kind of change our nomenclature because we don't want to use words that make some people think, well, this is reverse discrimination. I teach a course on environmental justice at Duke University, another distinguished academic institution in the South. And the first thing I tell my students in class, I want you to all know there's only one race, and that's the human race. We're all part of one human family. I met a very gifted and talented, famous molecular biologist in DC early this year. And he was telling me all the progress that has been made to unpack, to parse out the human genome, in other words, the DNA structure. And what most molecular biologists would tell us today, we may not want to hear it, is that all human beings are approximately 98% the same. It's only that 2% that determines hair color, skin color, shape of your nose, your ears. So if that's true, if we're all 98% the same, and at least the latest DNA research says that we all, that genetic structure started in Africa, then I'm speaking to all of us are Africans. I know that's strange for me to come to Mississippi and tell us that we're all Africans. But what I'm trying to make the point is how we identify, how we categorize, how we define has consequences. And sometimes people are left out of the definition or left out of the consideration. And that is why on that fateful day I was arrested in Warren County, North Carolina, I'm in the Warren County jail, I said, this is environmental racism. Now, I hadn't really unpacked the term yet, but I knew that's what it was. I later unpacked the term. The definition of environmental racism is the disproportionate targeting of communities of color for exposure to environmental hazards. But it is also the exclusion of people of color in environmental policymaking. It is also not taking into concert remedies or enforcement of environmental laws, which is also discriminatory. In other words, some communities are allowed to continue to suffer even though they are identified as hotspots by the EPA and others they still haven't worked on cleaning these communities up. What happened in Flint, Michigan was predicted. And one of the things that you need to know about a community that gets lead poisoned, there's no detoxification for lead poison. That means the people in Flint, Michigan who have lead poison, they're going to be living that for the rest of their lives. So in a sense, for me, the civil rights movement and the environmental justice movement and the climate justice movement, these are questions and movements about life and death. These are questions and movements about how to not only protect people, but I think the policy should also help people to enjoy the quality of life. If we say that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, that means we all should be enjoying the fullness of God's creation. You know? And I think that one of the things I've learned in the movement myself, a little bit of freedom is not sufficient. A little bit of justice is not sufficient. In fact, one could argue that a little bit of freedom from one group and no freedom from another group is not freedom for anybody. So part of what we're learning in the Southern environmental justice theater is that if America is ever going to solve its environmental problems, it needs to first solve them in the South. Because if you solve them in the South, you solve them for the rest of the nation. I would say something also about America's racial problems. If we solve them here, we solve them for the rest of the world. And so there's tension between whether or not we have the willingness to engage in practices, to engage in public policy, to engage even in academic settings about these issues that impact particularly this region of the United States. And so universities like Ole Miss or universities like Duke or other major universities, LSU, all the major universities in the South, they should be engaged on this issue. You know, we should have PhDs in environmental justice, PhDs in environmental science, PhDs in social policy, public school social policy. Because a lot of the times the people who legislate at state level and at the congressional level, I'm sure you know, members of Congress and members of state legislatures are only as good as their staff. So a lot, they're elected, but they depend on their staff to keep them informed before they make policies, before they draft policies. And unfortunately, a lot of people that work, and I'm not excusing members of Congress or state legislatures, no, but my point is, a lot of times things get implemented, things get legislated to try to help people, not involving the people they're trying to help, and it winds up making the problem even worse, or it helps to prolong misery rather than to resolve it. And so while we've had 3 presidents of the United States sign executive orders on environmental justice, first was Clinton, then Obama, and more recently, Biden signed an executive order. And the reason why they signed executive orders is because they couldn't get it through the Congress. So they felt they would sign executive orders to help at least give people to respond. Before Dolly and I came here this morning, we were listening to the news this morning. President Biden is having probably his last cabinet meeting. And the topic of discussion is, by October 31st, all this federal money that's been allocated in the infrastructure bill and other bills, it's been slow rolling out. Even though it's approved by legislation, by allocation, that money's been slow. So now over the next 30 or 40 days, they have to rush to get the money out of this fiscal year. And you know what happens when there's a rush that takes place. Only those who are well organized, those who've had some history of federal grants, will get the grants. And the communities, particularly in environmental justice communities, who don't really have the infrastructure to compete for the resources, they're probably going to get left out. Not because that's what the Biden-Harris administration wants. Dolly, have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Okay.
So
Let's give Dolly another hand. She's the mother of the woman. Time goes fast. I'm still in my introduction. So I'm going to have to speed things up here. Because I know we want to have questions and answers. So let me just go to the 3 points. Number 1, today, the movement for environmental justice in the South, I think, should be the trendsetter for the movement of environmental justice throughout the world. I've indicated earlier that what the history has been, but now I'm talking about the future. What is it we can do together to understand better? I think people should learn from history. I'm not a historian, but I try to learn from it, because there's some things in history you don't want to repeat. And I think history is a great teacher. If you can get the facts, if you can get the truth, we can learn from it. So the history of the movement for environmental justice in the South is a great history, but we need more films to document it. You know, before you did the film, a lot of people never heard of Warren County, never knew that it had happened. So we need more academic engagement around the issue of environmental justice in the South, particularly Southern academic institutions. Number 2, we need to regenerate environmental justice leaders who are interdisciplinary. No one discipline is going to solve this problem. We sort of need a sort of interdisciplinary approach. In social science, applied science, we need all, even last night we talked about the composition to the film. We need music, we need culture, we need poetry about environmental justice to help stimulate and to help encourage people to be active, not just to be aware, but to be active, engaged, to help make a change. And then thirdly, I'm very concerned about our young people. We need more young people in the movement. And I'm always encouraged when I come on college campuses or visit some other schools, secondary schools, I see young people hungry and thirsty for information. And so I think that we need more distribution of information about environmental justice, particularly for Generation Z and millennials. I think they can help make a difference. Globally, most of the climate justice movement is led by young people, which I think is very encouraging. And I would say led by young women, which also I think is very encouraging. Because part of the problem historically in the South is that movements are led by men, not by women. There's some exceptions. Fannie Lou Hamer in this state, her famous quote, "I'm sick or tired of being sick or tired," and how she spurred the voting rights movement and other movements here in Mississippi. There are other persons like Dolly in this state who really need to be engaged, not only in the academic setting, but support. So I believe, I just want to end on an optimistic note before we open up for questions. I've come to Mississippi today basically to encourage you. Not so much to challenge you, but to encourage you. Time has not run out. You know, I heard J.D. Vance on the TV the other day, he said, "Oh, it's over, time is up." I mean, that's the most cataclysmic, crazy thing to say. You know, the earth is not going to stop being the Lord's tomorrow, no matter who wins the election. And so we need to stop trying to get people to be so fearful that they fear change, they fear a future. Let's not fear the future, let's help shape the future by our engagement. And that is why I think Southern environmental justice is so important, not only to the South, but to all people in the world. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for a few questions. I'll try to give short answers. Yes.
My husband and I were story. And one of the things that we talked about afterward as having been just a powerful statement about what y'all felt like you were doing in Warren County
Yes.
was the fact that when we're trying to get things mitigated, or maybe it was when the state was proposing to pump out the water and dispose of it somewhere, that y'all said no. This can't, no other community should have to bear this. And so don't take it elsewhere in the state, don't take it to Mississippi, to Alabama. The problem stops here. And I thought that was a very powerful thing because it was an acknowledgement that what happened in Warren County can happen anywhere. And it was also an incredible act of solidarity, I thought, with other communities. And I wonder if you would talk a little bit about that, because, except that maybe I've just like rambled on about it for long enough, but what a decision that was. Because y'all could have been like, yeah, get it out of here. And I'd just love to hear
Thank you.
from you about that.
Well, I would say on behalf of the residents of Warren County who made that critical decision, was that once you experience that kind of injustice, you don't want another community to go through it. I deal with a lot of victims of gun violence. I'm just making an analogy. If you talk to the mothers of victims of gun violence, they don't ever want that to happen to another parent. And so they work. They can't bring their loved one back, but they work to make sure that others don't suffer like that. So that was the consciousness in Warren County. They knew that if the state did dig it up or extract the water, it's going to be placed in another community, and probably another community of color. Particularly, this is 1982 now, 1988, 1982 to about 1986, that 2-year period. So, to the credit of the Warren County residents, they felt that it would cause more harm to others to dig it up. And so what they did, the compromise was that the state had to spend millions of dollars to detoxify it on site. Now, the science is still out whether or not the detoxification actually worked, because as the state began to detoxify, those plastic things started leaking. You know, the science that had been told didn't prove to be correct. So now there are new scientific studies now about how to detoxify PCB. As an organic chemist, I would say, why do we produce it in the first place? PCB is used to keep transformers operating in electrical, and that's where these toxins originally came from. People dumped. Actually, they hired a company in Raleigh, North Carolina, to dispose of it properly, and the company, got paid, and they decided to dump it on the highway. So I think that, to answer your question, if you talk to the people in Warren County, they would say they didn't want any other county to suffer like they suffered. And I think it was almost a prophetic determination by the community that what they went through, they just simply did not want. That they would have felt guilty, or complicit. They didn't want to be complicit to some other community suffering environmental injustice. Other questions? Yes.
Kind of following on that question, the decision is really based on a communitarian philosophy.
Yes.
And thinking about our water crisis in our state capital, we have not really it's almost as if it's the problem of Jackson. It's no one else's problem. How do we begin to kind of reshape communitarian philosophy that will get us to see that Jackson's problem is everybody's problem?
Yes. Thank you. Very good question. I think that we should learn from what happened in Jackson. But how do we learn from that? I think that the governor of Mississippi, who was a Republican, should get in touch with the governor of North Carolina at that time, Jim Hunt, who was a Democrat. So we're not talking about a Republican governor who decided to dump on it. That was a Democratic governor. So the reason why I'm saying that, we have to transcend the politics. This is about, I will assure you that there are white Mississippians who live in Jackson, Mississippi, who are also being harmed by not having clean water. And unfortunately, the absence of having that kind of collective, even dialogue. I mean, I talked to the mayor of Jackson not too long ago, that they have a problem even having a meeting with the governor about it, because everything is so polarized. And polarization leads to a very entrenched understanding. It's very difficult to have a community approach if things are so polarized. People don't even recognize who their neighbor is. People don't even recognize who their fellow human being is. You know, and I think that's a problem that we all have to speak to, but do it in a way that kind of brings people together. I'm also thinking about some ways of how to get the governor, because it's just not, the governor is taking his position because he feels that's what the state legislature wants. You know, so it is the governor, but it's not the governor alone. And I think that, Lord have mercy, we could get environmental justice in Mississippi, we could get environmental justice across the South. And I think Jackson, Mississippi is a good place to start, not just because it's gotten a lot of media attention, but I'm thinking about the future of the capital city. You know, for a period of time now, not having the best or cleanest drinking water, that's going to affect not just the quality of life today, but it's going to affect the quality of life of others years from now. Because unfortunately, these environmental contaminants are very devastating to the human body. You know, so at some point, I think we have to talk about the industrial policy, the innovative policy of economics. Because to me, if someone knows a priority that what the byproduct of what you're producing is going to be so toxic, then I think you have to find another way how to make that product. I think that we've learned the consequences of not having environmental policy along with economic development policy, but I would also have an economic development policy not aligned with environmental policy. So another collective thing, I think that we need everybody at the table to plan, everybody at the table, but most importantly, the people in the communities that are going to be affected. And a lot of times, communities at the grassroots level are the last to even be informed of what the problem is, and have very little opportunity for them to participate in a community-wide way as it was in Warren County. Keep in mind, Warren County was so predominantly black, you know, members of the county commissioner, city council and others were a little bit more sensitive because of the racial composition of the county. Although the decision was the eminent domain, it was made by the state, so there was nothing that the county could do to stop. But we learned something out of it. And even the EPA learned something out of it. EPA today is much more multiracial, multicultural, multilingual, and therefore much more effective and efficient. Other questions? Yes.
You mentioned the importance of engaging younger generations. There's so many distractions for everybody today, and so many challenges. How do we get through? How do we reach them?
Well, I'm going to answer your question by telling you what I'm doing, but I don't want everybody to try to go out and do what I do. I'm a strong proponent of hip hop, amazingly. So I just this week did an introduction to a hip hop artist album, and the first cut on the album is about environmental justice. But again, music, culture, poetry. See, I think science. We live in a society where it's almost kind of an anti-science syndrome. People don't believe in climate change until something devastating happens, and you say, "Oh, that's not man-made, that's God-made." But the science will tell you it's man-made, climate change. So I think that young people, to answer your question, we have to reach young people not only where they are, but we have to reach young people in means of communication that they embrace. While I know there's a lot of concern about social media because everything on social media is not accurate, but that does not mean that we should not use social media. I think we should be using social media websites that are focused on environmental justice, which have news distribution organizations that distribute environmental literacy so everybody can know how to be involved. And then lastly, I find that young people do want to know about this. I think a poll that the Pew Foundation did recently showed that young people worry about their future. Worry about whether or not they're going to always have clean air to breathe or clean water to drink. So their consciousness is there. What is missing is, what he said, the engagement. I think we need something that's intergenerational, because I think young people could benefit from the elders, but I think the elders could benefit from young people. And I think that we need more planning intergenerationally. A lot of times people want to involve young people, but want to involve them after the plan is done. I think we should involve young people in the planning around some of these issues, and I think it would be much more effective. So I hand back to you.
So I was thinking about how environmental justice movement is quite young compared to global history, and that the infrastructure, especially in the South, with universities, is kind of loose and it's still growing and building. And so, if you have any kind of comment or advice for academics who are interested in the movement, who want to stay in the South, where maybe perhaps they could move somewhere else into different education, things like that. Or do you have advice about somebody who wants to stay in the South and wants to stay plugged into environmental justice, academically, but also just socially, if there's groups that we should be plugged into?
Yes, thank you. Does the University of Mississippi, do we have a Center for Environmental Justice?
We do have folks focusing on water issues over the legal department.
In the legal department.
School of Law.
So I would recommend not just Ole Miss, but all the major universities in the South ought to have centers for environmental justice that are interdisciplinary, undergraduate and graduate. Because this way, we are learning more and more every year about the toxicology, the epidemiology, the intersection between public health and climate, public health and environment. And we need more cross-references across disciplines to come up with solutions. And so where I teach now at Duke, I'm trying to encourage them to start a Center for Environmental Justice. And those of you who work in administration, universities don't make their decisions overnight. Sometimes it's quite a journey to get a major university to commit, as you point out, to something that's relatively young, but not too young. And I think that you will have more success if you have an interdisciplinary approach, where you have the deans of major schools decide this is something that would be helpful to the university as well as to the students and to the community. The last thing I would say is that universities also ought to have a relationship with the communities that surround the universities. I think there's a vast reservoir of good information, but a lot of times our academic institutions are kind of isolated from the communities that surround the universities. So I would say having community groups have some ability to have dialogue, even scholarly dialogue with people on the academy, I think helps to build the building blocks for the eventual Center for Environmental Justice. Yes, ma'am.
I like your idea of a Center for Environmental Justice. Being a former resident of Jackson, Mississippi, and having gone through water crisis there twice, I realized the importance of this type of work. But what we found was that there was a type of complacency among the community, the members of the community, as well as those who were outside of the community and heard about it through the publicity, the national publicity and media outlets that came to the city and put the information out there. And there was a type of Band-Aid type of response. Let's send them bottles of water. And as a person who's living there, the bottles of water are okay, but I can't wash my clothes with a bottle of water. And and all of these types of Band-Aid initiatives were prominent from people who could have put more of a economic pressure on our governor.
Thank you. Well, your observation is accurate. The difference between Warren County and some of these other places is that the people who lived in the community were not complacent because they saw the imminent danger. They saw the imminent harm. And even when the water crisis was developing in Jackson, you're right. See, sometimes if you live with injustice long enough, the injustice appears to be normal rather than abnormal. And I think the tolerance of injustice, the tolerance of abnormality is an American problem. And I think that we do need to encourage people not to be complacent, to be involved. I would say that if we had a way to better inform the people who lived in Jackson, this is prior to the crisis, I think when it happened, there would have been much more engagement. I know some of the leading pastors in Jackson, and I was encouraging some of them, but because some of the leading pastors, they don't want to work with the pastors who are not leading. So this kind of divisiveness in our community, I'm not just picking on church, but using an example. I think that we learn, and I think that hopefully, the governor will have a change of heart. But to me, you can't have a change of heart until you have a change of mind. Now, some people say that you get a change of heart, it changes the mind. Well, if your heart is rigid, then your mind is going to be rigid. And I think that Mississippi, I think, has a great, when I drove here from Memphis, I said, wow, this is a great place for not just agriculture development, but all kind of development. And I think Mississippi hurts itself when it doesn't see the promise of having the affirmation of the oneness of our humanity. We should see all Mississippians as part of one Mississippi family. And I know that's hard to get our arms around, but that's what it's going to take, without trying to seek retribution for the past. I think the future, keep in mind, the future is longer than the past. Hopefully. Other questions?
Time for a couple more.
Yes, in the back.
About the Environmental Justice Center, what would be like the recommendations for going about something like that?
Well, my experience at other institutions is that first you got to get the deans. The deans of applied science, the deans of the Old Miss Heaven Medical School.
Jackson.
Interesting.
It's
So,
ironic.
yeah. You can't get all deans, get a small group of deans to discuss it, and then have a meeting with the provost. Because the way a university will act more quicker, if they knew that there are millions of dollars of federal grants that are going to be distributed to Centers for Environmental Justice, I think it will kind of overcome the inertia. But that's what I would recommend starting. But also, most university administrators are very sensitive to what the students want. So I think if students would express to the decision makers here at Ole Miss, we want a Center for Environmental Justice, I think you get a good response. Consciousness of social change doesn't happen overnight. It's over a period of time. And I think that, to use your term, to get people out of despair, out of some form of alienation, out of some form of hopelessness, I think people should be made aware of people in like circumstance who decided not to be constrained by hopelessness, not to be constrained by despair. And that's really the story of Warren County. I mean, who would have thought that a global movement could arise out of that southern rural community? To me, that's very inspiring. That's why it films, but a lot of people still don't know about it, you know. So we need more public education. We need more. I do a television show and a radio show, and from time to time I try to have people who are in climate or environment on the show, just to kind of. There are so many. Let me put it this way. Last point. There's a lot of good news out here, but you will never know about it. Because our media tends to focus on the negative. Our media sometimes feeds the despair, feeds the hopelessness. And when there's somebody that does something innovative that gets water improved, it doesn't make news. So we have to kind of build alternative ways of getting that good news out. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of good news stories in Mississippi that I don't know about. You know, I would love to know about those good stories. Because to me, I can organize and mobilize people better when I have examples to show them how people are rising to the occasion. That's why whenever I talk about the civil rights movement to young people, I just don't talk about all the tragedies. Because if you just talk about the tragedy, young people say, well, I don't want to be in that movement. You know, so people need success stories to help them to come out of that despair. We're good?
We're good. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.